Well, it's a real pleasure to be here in Paris. I'm from London, from University College London, where I'm Professor of Ukrainian Studies. I've always looked at both Russian and Ukrainian politics. They are very much intimately interrelated, but particularly during the current time of warfare and political warfare. A definition of political warfare will follow. I would argue that it's related to domestic practice called political technology. Political technology is basically, in a very literal definition, engineering the political system. Political warfare, well, warfare is normally between states, but it can be civil war. But it's between two entities using political methods rather than kinetic actual fighting. And that includes disinformation, but certainly is not confined to it. Now, there have been plenty of studies of the mechanics or the tools of Russian disinformation or propaganda. What I'm trying to do in this paper, though, is look at what the Russians think they're doing, what they're trying to do. The pseudoscience of Russian disinformation. Russian propagandists are paid a lot of money because they claim to be scientific in their approach. But what are they trying to do? Well, one answer that is associated with this book on the left, Peter Pomerantsev, which I'm pretty sure is out in French, anything. Russia has existential freedom to do whatever it wants. Nothing is true and everything is possible. Narrative is disposable, can be created. There is still some truth in that. I would argue that Russia is not an ideological state. It employs ideologues or propagandists to provide elements of ideology, which are increasingly authoritarian and imperialistic, but in service of those tasks, rather than being seriously ideological. You get the same image in this book and now film, which I gather has been very popular in France, The Wizard of the Kremlin. It talks about the same wizard as Pomerantsev does, which is Vladislav Surkov, and portrays him as this kind of all-powerful creator of anything possible. The second kind of image is that Russia is basically disruptive. Russia's war on everybody and what it means for you is the title of this book by Keir Giles. But what Russia is doing is parasitic on divisions within Western society and fundamentally seeks to exploit and worsen them. Again, there's some truth in that, and I'll come back to that. The truth is close to Keir Giles' view of the world, but not exactly that. So what the paper looks at is how what is called political technology developed in Russia in the noughties and 90s as a means of controlling domestic politics completely. By midway through the 2000s, roughly Putin's second term as president, politics was entirely controlled, scripted, theatrical. Therefore, political technology in Russia is a kind of mature industry, an outward-facing domestic service industry. So there is what Russians call a curator in the presidential administration. That's deputy head of the administration, Sergei Kirilenko. There's money, a whole range of special funds, spetsfondy, to entice and employ propagandists to work for the Kremlin on particular tasks, but with particular methods derived from these domestic control methods of the 90s and the noughties. Basically, the invention of political subjects and narrative, to the extent that you knit them all together to create a common narrative, a virtual chorus saying the same thing. So this guy's called Ilya Gambashidze. He is one of the new generation of propagandists, fulfilling exactly the role I described, earning a lot of money by working for the Kremlin. And this is a kind of visual representation of the kind of virtual chorus. This rather sinister conference that took place just over a year ago shows all of the elements in the propaganda system around the same table: historians, political technologists, government ministers, all laying down the line about Ukrainstvo. The paper isn't about that directly, but I'm very happy to explain that in Q&A. It's the propagandistic ideal that Ukrainian is not an ethnic identity, it's a political choice made under the pressure of the West. I'll leave that bit out. So what I did in my paper is to look at 3 countries. In Moldova, there is a lot of political space for Russia to operate. It is able to use these political technology methods to a considerable degree to affect the political architecture of the country and the online media architecture too. And as many of you may know, huge amounts of money and resources were put into 3 elections recently. Well, 2 elections and 1 referendum. Sorry, that's a bateau mouche coming past, so I'll just close the window. And so to a considerable degree, Russia was able to influence about half the parties in the recent elections, and a huge number of media outlets. On the left, you see the parties. Basically, Russian parties came 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, but didn't quite manage to stitch that together in a majority. Countermeasures were very effective, and I'll, if I have time, talk about some of that. And on the right, you see how this is an attempt to kind of map the kind of entry points that Russia created into the Moldovan media landscape. I'll leave that out for now. My main data set is internal Moldovan reports about all this. Now, you may say that they're biased. It's the government's point of view, trying to defend itself against these Russian operations. True. But insofar as their counter operations were really effective, they had identified the right things, the right parties, the right media. It was a very difficult game for them of whack-a-mole, sort of banning one party and then another one would come along and you would try and take that out. But ultimately, the authorities weren't able to win that particular election. That is a country then with kinetic possibility for the Russians. You had a very similar model in Ukraine not that long ago. Roughly between 2018 and 2021, you had a very similar model of Russia-backed political parties, but with a kind of flanking virtual chorus of media, think tanks. The Russian word for think tank is actually a factory of thought, which is a very different thing to a think tank. And NGOs. Something needs to go in front of NGO there. Not exactly gongo, because they were private sector, but they were kind of externally funded from Russia. The Ukrainian authorities actually moved against this empire of influence in February 2021, precisely because it was so successful. Pro-Russian parties, media have now largely been shut down. So what you've got left in Ukraine, apart from on the temporarily occupied territories where Russia has complete control, is basically online media, what Russians call secondary infection. You don't have the kind of network of platforms that Russia was able to set up in Moldova. but you can seed and influence local platforms and international ones. Though there are still some networks left. The church network, which has a lot of NGOs, websites, and media channels, is still largely has not been dismantled. If you look at Telegram, you can see this is in Ukrainian, but it's basically showing a rise in propaganda spend on Russian propaganda spend on Telegram channels in Ukraine since 2022. This one shows the kind of network that Russia has backed within Ukraine. This one shows the sorry, this is all in Ukraine, but this one shows just that amongst the top 10 Telegram channels, 2 are blatantly pro-Russian, and plenty of others on the right. It says in the white letters on the blue background, info terrorists on Telegram. So 2 in the top 10 and plenty more. There's a broader problem here, which is that the presidential office of Volodymyr Zelensky also uses Telegram a lot, so it doesn't want to take measures against it because it's useful to the authorities too. And this is a kind of an attempt to show how the many Telegram channels interact. You should red and green are kind of mainstream. It's the purple ones that you want to look at that are identified by this research as pro-Russian, and you can see them intertwining and interacting with other audiences on Telegram. So again, official reports about that will be my one source of data for the paper. The other, messaging on Telegram and global platforms, particularly YouTube and TikTok. So if in a country like Moldova, you're able to create fake parties, in Ukraine now, Russian-backed fakes are kind of online. This is the one that has most traction. Again, it's in Ukrainian. In white, it says busificatia, busification. Now, there are these small buses that investigate whether people are dodging the draft, young men. But online, this is turned into this huge exaggerated drama using actors often to imply that this happens all the time, that it's violent. People are, as you can see in this video, bundled into the back of the vans and beaten up. That this is happening everywhere in Ukraine, that it's happening in your town yesterday. But that's staged online. This is clearly staged because this shows how unpopular the Ukrainian authorities are. If anybody knows Kiev, this is actually Bankova Street. The pillars are the office of the presidential administration. This is where Zelensky made his famous video a couple of hours into the fighting saying, "I'm here. I haven't left. We will defend Kiev together." That is currently cordoned off, and there are sandbags everywhere. That simply couldn't happen. You know, this is a kind of AI staged fake protest to show that the authorities are unpopular in Kiev and that everybody's protesting against them. Influencers, popular TV personalities are faked with AI, words put into their mouths. Sad stories about crying conscripts in this case, amplifying grievances within the armed forces, claiming that the authorities are letting them down. All of which, of course, is part of a broader aim to lower morale and support for the ongoing war. Finally, there was a huge leak of documents from Mr. Gambashidze. If you remember the guy in the flak jacket, a rather self-aggrandizing individual who has propaganda team #1 written on his jacket. There was a huge leak of documents from Well, not just from his work organization, but from Kremlin meetings, which he got in a real amount of trouble for. It's interesting that the propagandists and the Kremlin employees all use the same Zoom network. But in it, the pseudoscience that Gambashidze talked about is international conflictology in these kind of leaked documents, which also became part of a US Department of Justice endowment, in two types. Algorithm for exacerbating existing conflicts, algorithm for working with potential conflicts. So Russian propaganda methods tend to be more effective when they're working with the grain, when they've established and exacerbated a conflict or a tension point that already exists. But they do talk about inventing things more or less from scratch. And the vocabulary that they use is really interesting. They go back and forward between fake and real in Russian. And it makes no sense whatsoever. The only thing that does make sense is us versus them. This is information war in both senses of that couplet. It's war, so everything is justified. All that matters is us versus them. And control of information, manipulation of information is a necessary part of war. There was another leak of documents from Gambashidze a few days ago by Delphi news organization in Estonia and others. And this is the kind of key phrase that constantly recurs: delivering consecutive cognitive strikes. So again, this kind of militaristic language, not just language, but because you are at war. And this is just the information part of it. Finally, for the paper, I'll pick a third country. So we have Moldova, where kinetic methods are possible. We have Ukraine, where Russian fakery is largely online. For the third country, I wanted to pick a country more in the middle, where there are some kinetic possibilities for the Russians to work with. That would probably be the USA, because you have domestic propaganda systems which are easy to interact with. Though some people have given me advice to look at my own country, the United Kingdom, where there is some evidence of current Russian operations that are kinetic, if you like, to shift votes away from the governing Labour Party towards the Green Party and others, or a country like Bulgaria, where there are pro-Russian forces that still exist. So there are some more scope for kinetic operations. Or I could pick France, or I could derive some lessons that might be relevant for the French elections next year in terms of what types of Russian information war to expect. I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I don't know if I should thank you for giving us all these terrible news.
Well, it's actually even worse.
Yeah, I mean, it's awful. I mean, political technology as a mature technology, cognitive strikes. I mean, this is unfortunately this is what's happening, and the worst is that because it is in fact a kind of science, right? It's propagating, and so we're upping the game of how to do cognitive wars, right? I'm actually a great fan of Russian social psychology, which was pretty advanced compared to Western psychology. And it's very sad to see how it's been applied to these awful, operations. I would be very interested in you taking France as one of your examples, as you suggest, of course, but it's lessons for us all. Who wants to ask a question to Andrew now, or a comment? I think it ties so well to what Chris just told us, and it's you know, what we have been observing here is either the use of those technologies for commercial purposes, just to get audience by providing, you know, things that catch attention in the media model, or just sort of amateurish attempts to use these channels for various, you know, complaints or stupid, you know, aggressive rants. But what you're describing here is really the rise of an industry, and an industry that is now being supported by more and more powerful tools. And what we can do with AI in terms of fakes is just scary. And the idea that this thing is intertwined with real stuff, I mean, is a massive danger, and it's probably one of the most worrying things that you have been describing to us. This is not just a factory of fake. This is a factory of kind of blurring the difference between the reality and fiction. Sean.
Yeah, one thing about scale is that part of the research will look at these special funds, spetsfunding, and how big they are in terms of funds for propaganda. And then the other is use of AI. That Russia has adopted this massively, both to produce its own propaganda and with what they call LLM grooming. So the idea is to feed LLM models in the West with propaganda, basically.
Yeah, seeding, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So if I don't know, 5% of global discourse says that all Ukrainians are Nazis, then if you add another 5% into the mix, then that's what the LLM model might well tell you. Right? 10% of the world says all Ukrainians are Nazis.
So
Sorry, questions.
We had a question from Sean and then Willie. Yeah.
I mean, I admit a fair degree of ignorance in this area. It's just fascinating to hear. You know, I think for me, the stories, and these come through the mainstream media. Obviously, you're more privy to more nuanced data, but the stories that always strike me are the on-the-ground reports of the generation of the misinformation, the attacks, the strategies. I mean, in the misinformation era, it was like, you know, warehouses of people sending out texts. I think that was, you know, during the first Trump election, they were farms, or they were, you know, purposefully just had people posting on Twitter and those kinds of things. It's fascinating to see these internal algorithmic directives on how to do it. I was curious. I mean, I can't. I mean, if there's a science of misinformation in Russia, is there an analytics? Like, is there like a data analytics of the effects? Because it seems like they must be equally as sophisticated about measuring the impacts of their work. I was just curious if, like, you know, if you have any idea of how they're measuring. You know, they're not just like saying trying things and like they don't care what happens. They're clearly being very intentional. So they must have some way of measuring, like, this works well because it achieved this causal effect, and this one didn't. So how, you know, how are they aggregating their understanding of the results of their efforts? Or are they? Or is it just random? Are they just trying things?
Well, there was a lot of disinformation in the Soviet era and the Tsarist era, if you want to go back to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which had a big impact. Traditionally, in a very different world, Soviet, the KGB mainly didn't bother measuring impact because it was difficult to measure and slow often. But these guys do, or at least they have a kind of work environment where they report back to the boss, which is Kirienko, and a woman called Zakharova underneath him, whose pseudonym in these documents is Christine Keeler. That's from a British spy scandal in the 1960s. They have numerical targets. I think there was one for France, if I remember it rightly. Roughly, no, I don't remember it rightly, but I remember it roughly. 20, about a quarter of the French oppose NATO. So let's try and make it 30%. It was roughly there. It was kind of task of that magnitude. So it looked achievable, right? Rather than, shifting it to 90% or whatever. So yeah, these guys set numerical targets. But then in terms of saying we met those targets, a lot, is that real? They do opinion polling and sometimes show shifts. The other one that I remember from the documents was that in 2024, one of the 3 votes in Moldova was a referendum on making the aspiration to join the EU constitutional on the same day as the presidential election. Roughly about 80% of Moldovans want to join the EU, but the Russians had this barrage of propaganda against it, saying that the president has scheduled this on the same day just so she can win re-election, kind of piggybacking on the popularity of the EU, and almost failed. So the referendum only scraped through with 50% and a bit, 50.08 or something. So this was cited as evidence. 80% of Moldovans normally back the EU, and we got it down to 50. So yeah, within the leaked documents, there is that kind of reporting. Whether they're accurately assessing the effects of their propaganda, though, maybe that's part of the annual review meetings. I don't know.
Thank you. Willie?
Hi, my question expands on Sean's. Thank you very much for the talk. So you're still choosing the third case, and I was wondering, since 2016, there has been a lot of studies in the US since Donald Trump's first election and the Cambridge Analytica case. So what did you have time to read the empirical literature that tries to establish the effects on elections, the measurable effects on elections in the US, in other countries that you might synthesize, and what would be your take on what happened in Trump's second election? What was the role that this type of propaganda or of misinformation strategies played in the US? Even if you're an expert on Ukraine, and of course, but I don't know if you had time to check the literature.
I did. I wrote a book in 2024, which was called Political Technology, the Globalization of Political Manipulation. So it was about common patterns in, across the globe, but also about transnational political warfare. The best book, well, the book that I like the best about 2016 is by Catherine Hall Jameson. I don't remember the exact title, but I agreed with her analysis that Russian interference did matter. The 2016 election was very, very close. A few tens of thousands of votes in a few states. So various factors could claim to have swung the election. But her argument was mainly about indirect effects. The mainstream media framings, including how the debates between Clinton and Trump were structured, reflected Russian framings. Right, a lot of stuff about Clinton being untrustworthy or in hoc to international capital, American oligarchy or whatever, had been strongly pushed by the Russians. Not exclusively, but in 2016, most mainstream media aren't aware that there is this massive Russian operation. Obama was, and he did this incredibly stupid thing, which was not only to send private messages to the Russians rather than interfere, because he thought that would have been seen as partisan support for Hillary Clinton. There should have been a massive publicization of this. So I found Jameson's analysis pretty convincing in that what she's mainly claiming were indirect effects. She wasn't saying that millions had been persuaded directly by what they knew was Russian propaganda. It was the way mainstream narratives in the election were shaped. So fast forward, platforming, which is part of political technology, how you create platforms to spread either narratives or propaganda, is a huge part of political technology. We all know about deplatforming. And I think for Trump that worked initially after the January insurrection in Washington. He was kicked off Twitter and whatever. There's some excellent analysis which basically shows the Republican media universe, and it looks like someone has shot 2 holes in it. So it hasn't collapsed, but you know, these key Trump accounts are suddenly missing from the kind of general conversation. I did say in the book, which came out in 2024, that the key to who won the 2026 election would be rebuilding the megaphone. Little joke. That Trump had been kicked off Twitter, but huge efforts would be put into kind of rebuilding the media ecosystem, which is exactly what happened. Not just Truth Social, but the huge rise in podcasting and all these other multiplications in the Republican or even MAGA media ecosystem that happened between 2020 and 2024. So Trump had his MAGA phone back, and his messages was being amplified. And finally, I think there is some research that Russia did less in 2024 than it did in 2016, because Trump's message was already pretty loud enough on its own terms. Transnational campaigns can be effective, I think, is a more general conclusion. And they're certainly proliferating. And they're now part of the official US foreign policy. The National Security Review includes that point about interfering in foreign elections.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one more question, Andrew. So, I mean, the way we address these things with Western psychology or sociology is pretty much based on, classic theories on persuasion, influence, dissonance, stuff like that, right? But what we can see are that there are hybrid operations. This is not just about the content of information. There's also a series of actions there. Would it be possible in your paper to sort of show what kind of theoretical infrastructure, I mean, this new industry of political technology stands, right? And what I've been always surprised is the very small amount of Russian science or Soviet science that has gone through the barriers of the wall at the time. I mean, we had some activity theory going to Scandinavia and now being more distributed and known, but there's an immense amount of the Russian Soviet social science that is unknown. That was part of the success of the spatial missions, for example, things like this. If you could bring us a little bit of that stuff, that would be really interesting.
I zoomed through the slides showing international conflictology. So the aim will certainly be to explain that and its antecedents. So there was maybe some good sociology in the Soviet Union, but there was also something called humanitarian technology. There is father and son here. There was a guy called Georgy Shedrovitsky in the 60s, a Soviet sociologist, Soviet Russian sociologist, and his son Pyotr is now a political technologist. So basically, the son and the father are kind of the same. Political technology is about engineering political systems. Humanitarian technology is about manipulating people with information systems. And the father was very popular. It's part of this Soviet dream of using science to manage things, including the economy, better. But it was his son who came up with the idea of Russian world, Ruski Mir. And it's really important to know that this idea was not about finding and supporting Russians. It's about creating, particularly in contest with other civilizations in the world. So it's the idea that you can use humanitarian technology, information systems, media, whatever, education, to make people Russian. And that's actually what Russian world is as an idea. Unfortunately, being viciously implemented in the occupied territories in Ukraine.
Thank you. Natalie, I see you have a question.
Yes, I have a question on a very minor point. I'm curious, when you use the term virtual cohorts, I really like the idea. And at the same time, I was wondering whether you use the term virtual as a way to point to digital media, or do you also include legacy media and online media? So it's a question on whether the virtuality here is referring only to online, or if, but because I picked up also on another term, which is pre-realities, which I think is very interesting. And that also talks to this virtual dimension of seeding and crafting the possible, which is what the virtual is compared to the actual in like Deleuze's thought, for example. So I was just curious on how you use this term virtual, whether, yes, I'll stop here.
I wrote a book called Virtual Politics, which came out in 2005. Subtitle was Faking Democracy in the Post-Soviet World. So it described processes through the 90s and the early noughties. So in politics, the political technology started off with individual projects. Right? Let's build a fake party. And then that kind of matured into the 1996 election, where Yeltsin was going to lose, but they created one particular project whose covert aim was always to back him in the second round, which won. And then you progress to what I call virtual political geometry, which is basically controlling all of the political parties and how they interact in kind of geometrical space, metaphorical geometrical space. All of this is highly mediatized because you need to tell a story about why these fakes are real and about the interaction processes. And in the 90s and the early noughties, that was TV. very much TV. In fact, one of the political technologists, a guy called Gleb Pavlovsky, says TV saved Russia. Right? The Communist Party was gone, military force was weak. TV saved Russia, according to him, by creating this virtual reality. To the extent that the Kremlin's propagandists were a bit late to react to the rise of new media, internet, social media. So in the 2011-2012 election cycle, if you remember that one, there were lots of protests against election fraud, and it was often classified as the party of the internet, the cool people, the opposition, against the party of TV, right? The stupid provincial Russians just sitting on their sofa and consuming propaganda. So that was 2012, and then the Russians massively upgraded their online operations, social media operations. So a lot of this is now social media. TV still matters quite a lot in Russia. Doesn't in Ukraine. Everything is social media now. That's the entire narrative battlefield, if you like. So yeah, virtual in all of the senses. And particularly in the final sense that this is mediated reality, but a reality that these people think, I mean, that word pre-reality is this kind of Nietzschean idea that there's no dichotomy between the fake and the real. There is simply our work. Right. We create reality. And then there's another phrase which is slightly different, augmented reality. Sometimes there's a reality and we add things to it. But the idea of pre-reality is this idea that, you know, we are Nietzschean superhumans and we are reality is what we say it is.
Thank you again, Andrew. Well, sobering and really food for thought, as are all these talks more generally in this Paris Ideas.